Subset of our discussion on emotionally healthy spirituality to understand how we have the flesh, the world, and the devil, James 4, Ephesians 2, afflicting us so powerfully even after salvation, the premise being that most of our behaviors, most of our inclinations are formed in us early in life, and especially through adverse woundings and traumatic events and things of that nature that will skew those things. So we've talked about issues ranging from lust and greed and the like. Tonight we're going to look at anger. And that is a very important topic because while many of the others that we have talked thus far are prevalent in contemporary Christianity and certainly without, they are often masked very well. Anger is a little more difficult, and it causes considerable problem in the church, in the community. I don't need to tell anyone what's happening socially, in the family structure, across the board. The statistics of anger-related violence are staggering, to say the least. Studies show that every 9 seconds in the United States, a woman is assaulted or beaten. Road rage or aggressive driving accounts for 56% of fatal U.S. auto accidents. In the year 2010, an average of just over 4 children died every day in the United States due to child abuse. The National Institute of Mental Health reports that 16 million Americans have been diagnosed as having intermittent explosive disorder. And then you have chronic low-grade anger that contributes to depression and heart disease and family conflict and addictive problems. So this issue of anger is very pertinent, and when we look at it, there's a couple of approaches that are taken socially, medically, even theologically that are worth consideration and really delving into what is the heart of the issue and how do we deal with this. One common answer, much like depression, is to medicate it, to take the edge off. In modern, or I should say contemporary psychology, there is the prevalent attitude that anger is a feeling, nothing more, nothing less. It's not right or wrong. It's just a natural feeling. That is a normal part of life, a natural, normal reaction to situations in which we feel hurt or rejected or attacked. And so from that vantage point, the issue is not that you feel angry, but what you do with the angry feelings that has the consequences, that has the importance. What I would submit to you is that the biblical response is quite different. It says that to simply medicate it does not change the factors that are causing it, that are still prevalent in your life. And it will never bring you to a holistic life because you'll never have freedom to be who you are truly called to be. And the attitude that anger in and of itself is not a problem, it's how you respond to it, it really removes the power that anger has from the equation. So when we look at it, it does not give it its proper due to recognize that to recognize anger as a natural reaction is not the problem. The issue is what becomes natural to you. And this approach does not allow for it. So what does the Bible say? In truth, a lot of people struggle with the topic of anger when it comes to Scripture because it it seems to contradict itself. The Bible tells us that God burns with anger. Yet it says, be angry and do not sin. We see Jesus is angered, and he uses that word at various times. But when the Apostle Paul gives his sin lists in Galatians 5 and Colossians 3, he warns against fits of wrath. We've been studying the book of James on Sunday mornings. He says the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. Most of what the Bible says about anger is negative. But the Bible also says be angry and do not sin. So the question is anger something that we should strive to moderate, or is it something we should work to eliminate? Well, Christian history has taken a very different approach to this throughout the ages. John Cassian, who is the individual who brings the original 8 that becomes the 7 deadly sins from the Eastern Orthodoxy to Western Christianity, his position was this: anger is rarely, if ever, justified. Just no go. His attitude is that anger can be properly directed at one's own sin, or even the evil demons that entice us to sin, but never at another human being. Because love of neighbor precludes anger targeted at another. Thomas Aquinas later will come in and say, this is not true. He will very much take the side that anger is a natural expression of human passion. It is not inherently bad. It is a right response, in Aquinas' view, to an injustice. When you see an injustice, it should arouse anger. But anger becomes distorted when it attacks the wrong thing or does so in a wrong way. Therefore, it's helpful when you're looking at the biblical approach and you're looking at your own life and you're ministering to others, it is helpful to distinguish anger, which is a normal part of human emotional makeup, distinguish that from wrath, which is anger in its sinful, excessive, misdirected form. Did you see how that happened with lust? Did you see how that happened with greed? There were things that were natural to the human condition and even God-given. But when misappropriated or misused, they went from virtue to vice. Aquinas' point is, anger is no different. There is a healthy anger. But when misused or misappropriated, it becomes a vice, which is called wrath. So, when it is good, anger is seen as passion for justice, motivated by love for others. When you see injustice, when you see someone done wrong, and this could be your child, this could be a social issue, this could be an oppression of a people group, that should evoke a response within you. Let me hit you with something here. Pop quiz time.
Ouch.
That Pastor Crystal's not allowed to answer. What is the opposite of clean, biblically speaking, theologically speaking? What is the opposite of clean?
Dirty.
Dirty. Most folks would say dirty.
Unclean.
Danielle would say unclean. I would side with Danielle, because if something is dirty, it can become clean. If something is clean, it's in right state before God. To not be that way is to be unclean. Think about what Jesus says, look, I have cleansed you. You're going to pick up some dirt on your feet. We're going to wash it. Everything's good. They are not unclean. They're just dirty. Okay? So Biblically speaking, the opposite of clean is unclean. What's the opposite of love? Most would say hate, when in fact it's not. In order to hate someone, you have love misappropriated. Something has been violated. You have an emotional attachment. The opposite of love, biblically speaking, is apathy.
Or you're just
not caring. Think about the scriptures that says God chastens those he loves. So he corrects us. He's not apathetic toward us. If he didn't care about us, that would mean there's no love. Even when anger is evoked, it is out of love. Seeing something being abused, oppressed. Do you follow me? Okay? So, anger, De Young will put it this way: great love is the root of great anger. You don't get angry unless you care. Now, the Lord cares greatly, but he keeps that anger in check. Psalm 103, verse 8 says, the Lord is merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love. He's slow to anger, but that doesn't mean he does not get to the point. God's anger is evoked, but time and again in Scripture, consider what evokes God's anger. It's when we are unfaithful to him and we violate his love. It is when we oppress the powerless, when we transgress justice, what is owed to God or owed to our neighbor. That evokes the anger of God, because it's a violation of his love. Jesus grows angry when the Pharisees don't want the man with the withered hand to be healed because it's a Sabbath day. The Bible says he is angered by this. He's angered by their refusal to love the neighbor and see him restored. And how does Jesus respond to them? He does the right thing according to God's justice right in front of them. He doesn't punish them. He doesn't chastise them in a demeaning way. He does what is right out of love. So there is a place for such anger. It's called righteous anger. When it is a holy emotion, anger has justice as its object and love as its root. It wants justice and love met. And these are both focused on the good of others. So perhaps you're already noticing the theme. Where does anger come from? It's when our focus is not on the justice and love of others.
It's probably from the justice of
ourselves. Quoting De Young once again. Good anger is expressed in passionate efforts to make sure others get the respect they deserve, to bring about the end of oppression and tyranny, to give due punishment to those who cause injury and damage, to honor covenants and promises, to give equal treatment to the marginalized, and to uphold the law. But that righteous anger turns vicious when it is self-regarding and is fighting for its own selfish cause. When it's no longer looking out for others, but looking out for self. Then we see anger, which is rooted in the right demand for justice, perverted into wrath, which is a desire for revenge and the injury of someone else for what they have done to you, or someone that you may love. Wrath twists any real concern about sin or injustice into the service of self. This is what I demand. This is what should happen. And it's often done to protect our own ego or to demand something we would not reasonably expect from someone else, to feed our own reputation, and to do so instead of admitting our complicity in something. Wrath is rooted in unholy expectation of what we are due and what others are due. That's where anger becomes wrath. Demanding something other than God's justice or love for others. We demand our definition of justice and our definition of respect for ourselves, or for those whom we love and feel have been done wrong. Augustine puts it this way in his prayer book, and I'm paraphrasing. He says, wrath seeks to eliminate any obstacle to our self-seeking, to retaliate against any threat to our security, to avenge any insult or injury to our person. That's what wrath does. It is defending us. Evagrius defines anger as a boiling and stirring up of wrath against one who has given injury or is thought to have done so. This is why Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount links wrath and wrathful insults to murder. You have heard it said, do not commit murder. I say to you, if you hate your brother, if you call him a fool, an idiot, you're making accusations, you've already committed murder. Why is he making that point? Because he's saying you've already transitioned into the misappropriated side, the twisted side of the equation. So, Thomas Aquinas would sum it up this way. Anger is when you wish justice upon another for the sake of righteousness and unity. Wrath is when you wish evil on another for your own selfish reasons, evil without measure and for its own sake. So the key to differentiating anger and wrath is this. Really what you're differentiating is justice from self-justification. Anger seeks justice. Wrath seeks self-justification. You're defining justice. How do we envision this? Well, do you typically get as angry about an injustice done to others as you do about a cutting personal insult made about you? Are you more angry about how others are done wrong than you are about somebody who says something ugly about you? Now you can start seeing the difference. Which one is dominant? Anger or wrath? A lot of times what happens when we get offended, our response is actually one of wrath, but we couch it as anger. Well, I'm going to be angry and not sin. I'm not going to go punch him in the face. But meanwhile, I'm imagining God striking them with a lightning bolt or them getting their due, or I can't wait till somebody finds out. Well, now I'm seeking retribution and revenge. I'm not seeking righteousness and justice. Do you follow me? Mm-hmm. This is a pretty steadfast issue, because we live in a society that justifies this, that we can, hey, they had it coming. Yeah. And we're not seeing the reason that we feel they had it coming and how God feels about they had it coming. So how does wrath manifest? Well, there are three key issues that we have to consider. How do we progress from anger to wrath? Well, number one, we have to consider what makes us angry. Number two, we have to consider what or who we blame for making us angry. And number three, we have to consider how we express that anger. And I'm going to take these in reverse order. So number three, how do we express our anger? Well, it's pretty apparent that we've progressed from anger to wrath when there's a loss of control. When we talk about when Jesus says, blessed are the meek, that word meek is not synonymous with weak. Meekness in Scripture is power under control. That's what meekness is, power under control. When we have a loss of control, we've got a problem. When we mentally magnify the offense or our woundedness, what it's done to us, or our worthiness compared to that of the offender, we've lost control. Even if we have a legitimate grievance, when we're dealing with it in destructive and disastrous ways, we're progressing into wrath. What are those destructive and disastrous ways? Aquinas says there's 3. Number 1, you get angry too easy. You have irritability. This poisons our mood. He says this is a pattern of behavior. And I'm going to support that. Modern studies indicate this is absolutely true. That this pattern of behavior will produce irritability. And now you have the tendency, you have conditioned your own brain to respond poorly and to progress from anger to wrath very quickly. The second disordered expression from Aquinas, we get angrier than we should. This is typically the result, when people are like, man, they kind of blew that out of proportion. Typically, it's not like they just don't have any control over it and all of a sudden there was an explosion. It's typically the accumulation of grievances or perceived assaults on the individual. It's the straw that broke the camel's back. Usually when somebody blows up over something that is seemingly insignificant, there's been a whole lot of powder poured into that keg. And this just happened to be the spark. That's unhealthy. Because what that is saying is there are issues that you're not dealing with, and when the right spark hits, you explode beyond anger into wrath. And you're not looking at rightly identifying the problem and fixing it, but demanding your recourse and your justice. Does that make sense? Third disordered expression. We stay angry too long. What he means by that is there's a refusal to forgive. There's a refusal to accept reconciliation. Even if we say it in words, we still leave wishing ill, not liking that person. I'll never let them fill in the blank. Fantasizing about vengeance. Daydreaming about, oh, it'd be great if that one came and then they came to work and then the boss found out that they actually did and then that they ended up getting fired. I just smile at them and say, well, yeah, you've got what was coming to you. When you start fantasizing about vengeance, you are really getting hammered by the sin of wrath. It owns you because it is controlling your thoughts. When you nurture resentment, wrath has you. That nurturing of resentment. Now, if you'll consider these, we went from how we express our anger to looking at the 3 disordered expressions, either a continuation of it will produce a characterization of irritability, or we allow it to compile until we blow up, or we just fixate on it. We even feed off of it. I'll give you a good example. I was talking about nurturing resentment. Let me give you one of the best examples in literature of this. It's the story of Moby Dick. Captain Ahab is consumed with a desire for revenge. He searches the seas for this mysterious and elusive white whale that has robbed him of his limb. Over time, he becomes more and more obsessed in his quest for revenge, to the point that he's more and more irrational, oblivious to the needs of others, his ship, even himself. In the climactic scene, Ahab exacts his revenge, but he does so at the cost of his own life. Trapped in the ropes, he's tied to the whale's side, and Ahab is bound eternally to the whale he sought to destroy, and thus is destroyed himself. That's what wrath does. The nurturing of resentment will tie you to your Moby Dick and destroy you along with it. And the fact is that the majority of people you meet, even in church, are hunting a white whale. Something has been done to them. Someone has done them wrong. They're waiting for the day, the chance, the moment when the stars align and the heavens open and justice is poured out and you're there to see it, not knowing that you're going to be tied to it. So that's how we respond, going from anger to wrath. The second point that I had made, going in reverse order, is the recipient of that. And the reality is, it's usually not the perpetrator who receives that wrath. It's the person who happens to be closest. You know, when Cheyenne goes to work, there's no doubt there are people who get their order and their food's cold, or it's wrong, or it's not cooked properly. Who takes the blame? Cheyenne, the waitress, because she's the one there. When you call customer service because they messed up your order, who takes the blame? Who takes the brunt of your wrath?
Cheyenne.
The customer service representative, right? Who did not build the item, who did not send it to you, who did not send it to the wrong address, but they bear the brunt because they're the closest. When you have a bad day at work, who takes the brunt of it?
Your spouse.
Your family. Because they're the ones closest. For some reason, we feel like we have a freedom to violate because of the relational status. So, when you see that you are taking out your frustrations, your anger, your bitterness on someone other than the perpetrator of the event, that's a pretty good indication wrath is taking hold. Because now you're directing it at someone who had nothing to do with it. Who might even be the person who can fix it. Or be the person who will stand beside you through it. That's a pretty good telltale sign that wrath is meddling in your business. Rather than changing what legitimately enrages us, anger typically hurts those that we love. That's what it does. It doesn't help us. It doesn't change the situation. We're still mad. But now we've hurt someone. Which brings us to the first point. The real culprit in cases of wrath is not typically those on whom our wrath is directed, even if they are the perpetrator. The real culprit is our excessive expectation of what we deserve or what we demand. The root of all wrath is pride, as it is with all the seven deadly sins. You have violated, you better recognize, you didn't give me my just due, you didn't honor. I feel violated. And perhaps I am, but I can still allow that to go into an unhealthy anger called wrath. But sometimes I have not. And that's a very common thing. But in my pride, I want to be heard. I demand. So I was talking about if you fantasize about, Billy Bonehead at work getting his just due, and you just want to be there the day it's revealed that he is not all he claims to be, and you fixate on that, and you are nurturing that, that is pride. Because in your mind, you are elevating yourself over them and wishing ill upon them. You are usurping yourself over them and feeding off the idea that you will be proven right. That's pride. That's also got a tinge of vainglory, which we'll be talking about soon. But pride's not the only catalyst for wrath. Another very common one is fear. A lot of times when people explode in that way, it's because they're addressing fear. The tendency to get angry, especially overly angry, wrathful. When people lose their sense of perspective and misjudge others' malice, it's often out of a heightened sense of their own vulnerability. They're afraid of what might happen. So they try to control the situation, or they try to control others. Or someone might steal their thunder, or somebody might do them wrong. So they automatically, sometimes people start dating and I couldn't find where you were for 2 hours, you weren't answering your phone. You must have been with someone, and boom, they explode. Why are they exploding? Because that fool didn't return my call. No, you're exploding because you had an irrational fear that they were with someone else, because you're assuming they're going to do that because you're not good enough. The real problem is how you view you, not whether or not they answer the phone. That's just the spark. Do you follow me?
Yes.
So anger in this situation, when it is birthed in fear or vulnerability, it will come out of force, but really that force is a cover-up for our own weakness and our own vulnerability. It's like a little chihuahua barking as hard as it can, trying to tell you, you better not mess with me, and you're thinking, you really don't want me to mess with you, you little chihuahua. It's a little weird thing, right? What are some other causes? I've given you two. What are some other causes of this explosive fear, the nurturing of resentment? Impatience. In what way?
You just grow impatient, so you get angry.
So that falls into an attitude, which is a very important aspect. Remember, it's a capital sin. What does that mean to say that wrath is a capital sin?
It is the
Chief, it's a primary sin.
primary.
It's a general on the battlefield that is commanding the other sins to participate in it. But it's also working with the other 6 in the 7 deadly sins. So look at it this way. Last week we talked about avarice, sinful greed. And we talked about that's not just material. That might be a position, that might be someone's spouse, that might be some kind of recognition, and we have an excessive sinful greed for that kind of thing. Well, what is it that causes avarice? Envy, vainglory, pride. These things cause avarice. What causes wrath? The denial of what we feel we are owed. So what happens is, whether it's envy or vainglory or pride, it tells us you deserve that. That should be yours. This honor is due you. Whatever the case might be. When we feel that has not been met, wrath rises up. Do you see how they're all working together? And then when wrath rises up, guess what you start doing? You start gossiping. You start fixating on their demise. You start stabbing things in the back. You start spreading little seeds. There's any number of things we can start doing. So now it becomes a capital vice that is causing all this other sinful behavior. That's how this works. So when we look at impatience, the impatience is a telltale sign that the greed, the avarice is at work. And since we're not getting what pride and vainglory and envy tells us we deserve, we're going impatient and we're about to explode because of wrath. What else causes wrath? Think about your own. It's okay to admit in here that there's times you lose your cool and you blow your top.
Like you said, just that expectation management, so feeling disrespected. For example, you talk about taking things out on your children or your spouse. Even though I may have had a bad day at work, if my children don't do exactly what I want them to do, it just kind of adds to it. And now I feel disrespected. But I think it goes back to what we talked about with the other innocent so far as something that happened when I was a child. So if I felt disrespected often as a child, then now anybody that disrespects me is an issue. Whether it's my children, whether it's you, and I may try to keep it together for so long, and half the time people don't even know that they disrespected you. It's something that you have to look at, and I allow that anger to mask whatever else I'm feeling, because I don't want you to know that I feel disrespected, or that I'm fearful, or that I'm ashamed, or whatever. So it's easy for me to flip out, or because society has made that acceptable, and we kind of fall into that. Oh, well, anger is a acceptable emotion because we all get angry, so I can flip out and flush you out and go on about my business instead of looking at myself as, no, I feel.
That's a very important point, because what will happen many times for the Christian is we'll get over the issues of pride. All right, someone else got the promotion. Well, good for them. I hope they do well. We realize, hey, God's my provider. Everything's good. Someone else got some honor. Well, good for them. My identity's in Christ. I'm good. And so you don't see yourself, your buttons aren't being pushed by those things anymore. You don't have fear of vulnerability. You are at a point where you're like, okay, hey, God holds my tomorrow. Everything's going to be good. You're letting patience have its perfect work. And then all of a sudden something happens and you go, ah! And people go, whoa, what was that all about? Well, many times what happened was there's something that you don't want to confront that has left you empty or broken, and you have been conditioned. Your response to that is one of anger, to try to stop. You're frustrated because it's shown back up. You don't want to address it, and it's something that, if you can imagine, if someone was sexually violated as a child, and every time they were sexually violated, the individual came up behind them and put their arms around them and whispered a phrase in their ear. What do you think their reaction is going to be if you walk up behind them and whisper that in their ear?
Yeah, they're gonna freak out.
They're gonna, it's immediate, they're right back there.
Yeah.
So there are some aspects of wrath that are habitual. There is, and this could be that you were raised in a house where anger was predominant, and so you learned that behavior. This could be where you were violated and anger became a wall for you. To try, like an animal that's cornered, to try to fend it off. There's any number, but then what ends up happening is what we have found is that research in neuropsychology shows that anger styles are wired into our brains. So we create and then reinforce our neural pathways within our brain that predispose us into that same pathway time and again. So whenever we find a circumstance like that, our brain automatically responds in that way. And so people will say, I don't know why I get angry like that. It's because you've been conditioned that way. That's how you were built. Yes?
I would say me personally, I've dealt with rejection from my son for years, and it's like you get angry, not just because of certain factors that have kind of conditioned the situation, but you're just, you're rejected and you lash out at, whoever's, I guess, closest, or when you're hurt, to protect yourself, because you want most people I don't think consciously want someone else to hurt as bad as they do. It's just you don't realize that that's what you're doing, because you feel so terrible about yourself because you've been rejected, and it hurts. It hurts, and so you just lash out at whatever comes up next,
Yes.
And I've done that a lot, in my past, and that's something God's been, bringing to my awareness.
So in that example, the rejection of another loved one, not reciprocating love, the anger is justified because love has been violated. That's one of the reasons God's anger is evoked. Love is violated. But it goes into wrath when we take the attitude that we are owed that, or we deserve that to be reciprocated. Even God doesn't go there.
Yeah.
So it's a situation of saying, I'm going to love you despite, because isn't that how God loves us? While we were still sinners, while we rejected him, he still loved us. Do you see how that? So the issue of it going into wrath falls into, what do I think I'm owed, or it can. I'm not saying that's the case for you, but I'm using that as an example of where we see anger, which is legitimate, become wrath because we're demanding something for ourselves. And over time, that's pre-programmed. That programming, we react automatically, quickly, intensely, impulsively. And if we, as a child, we expected love to be reciprocated from a parent, well, as soon as somebody does something that would suggest they're not reciprocating love in our adult life, we automatically go back to that because our brain has been wired that way. And so you see, my very first point when I said, well, anger is natural, it doesn't really matter, it's how you respond. Anger, that's not the problem. The problem is your response is already predetermined by much of your experience. So you have to relearn that. And you have to understand how anger is controlling you and how it's leading you into these things. That's the heart of the issue when it comes to anger and wrath. I think Sullender notes remarkably the similarity to drug and alcohol addiction. That this kind of anger, the cycle begins with an unmet emotional need. And then it moves to obsessive thinking, and then the buildup in tension, and then frustration when it's not provided. And then rage erupts into verbal or physical violence. And in the aftermath of the out-of-control behavior, there is release, there is shame, there's apologies, and then the cycle begins again. So you see that the role of anger to wrath is very similar to the role of the addict going to numb something. It's just an issue of identifying what is happening and how we're responding. DeYoung asserts that when you look at it this way, wrath is showing us trying to be God and failing. We are wrathful when we can't control the things that hurt us. Our anger is ready to remedy this vulnerability by taking full control of establishing justice in the world and avenging any wrongs against us. Wrath's expression, therefore, usually involves the assertion of control, even as, ironically enough, we lose control of ourselves when we are angry. It's an attempt to maintain control in which we lose control. But the reality is it's easier to lash out at others in a purported show of strength than it is to acknowledge what's really eating us up. To be angry is to feel control again. We feel like we're in control, even in our minds, if we're imagining scenarios. We feel like we're in control. If we blow them out of the water, we feel, man, I felt good. I let them have it. Yeah. We feel like we're in control again. But here's the kick. Anger presumes the power to fix things and change things, when in fact, it's not changing us. The same precondition exists. So, Buchner says this: of the 7 deadly sins, anger is possibly the most fun. To lick your wounds, to smack your lips over grievances long past, to roll over your tongue the prospect of bitter confrontation still to come, to savor to the last toothsome morsel both the pain you are given and the pain you are giving back. In many ways, it is a feast fit for a king. The chief drawback is that what you are wolfing down is yourself. The skeleton at the feast is you. You're tied to Moby Dick. So, what are the solutions? How do we resolve this? How do we rightly handle wrath? How do we prevent righteous anger from becoming unrighteous wrath? Let me give you a hint. Venting is not one of them.
I'm thinking of this, how the Bible tells you to guard your heart, and naturally you can think very easily about like external things, like, hey, you're gonna guard your heart against what you watch and what you listen to and the environments that you put yourself in, because that's gonna protect your heart, but it's beginning to really guard your heart from your own sinful thought patterns, really.
Okay, so following that line of thought, good insight. When we discuss lust, is abstinence the solution to lust?
No.
No, because you're still going to deal with it and probably in
Crave it
abundance.
even more.
You're gonna binge, right? Now, many times what we look to do is just remove the triggers, but that doesn't change the fact that the trigger is inside me. The explosive is still inside me. But we have to recognize the triggers. It's important for us to recognize the triggers because many anger management programs use the term reactive anger. Where someone has hurt us and we're reacting to that. The problem is we often overreact. So we do have to identify the triggers, and those triggers probably have histories. There's a reason that triggers us. But when we look at those triggers, the purpose is so that God can disarm them. That's the reason of identifying our triggers. And that's the reason why venting is not good. This was actually the primary approach for psychotherapy in the 50s and 60s. They thought if anger was expressed in appropriate ways, it would dissipate without harm. So that's the solution. The common image was that of a teapot. It's blowing off steam, and that's what you've got to do on a regular basis. So they encouraged you to beat a pillow or hit each other with styrofoam bats in counseling. And if you've ever seen the movie Analyze This with Billy Crystal, he tells the mafia guy, Robert De Niro, he's like, hey, hit that pillow. And he pulls out his gun and goes, bam, bam, bam. And he goes, yeah, I feel better. This was what he's using, this manner of psychotherapy. Well, it's failed. It's absolutely failed. From the 70s to the 90s, numerous studies were done that found that venting does not bring about peace. In fact, it does the opposite. So the prevailing motto, the more one gets angry, the better one will feel, it was replaced with a new motto. The more one gets angry, the more one gets angry. So when you're venting, you're just getting angry about the situation. Angrier.
Just keep talking about
You know, a lot of times we'll vent to somebody and we'll say, well, man, thanks for letting me vent. And then you know what you have to do? You know, I hadn't thought about that. That makes me mad too. And that's... So it didn't help you in the first place, and all you exhibited was ungodly behavior in doing so. The Young asserts that expressing anger in order to let off steam is a moral mistake. I would agree with her. Our anger will burn out of control when we vent. Dr. King said this: returning violence for violence multiplies violence, adding deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. When you are venting, you are operating in wrath, in hate, in ungodly activity.
Pastor, I think also oftentimes when we vent, we're venting to someone who may be a friend, but may not have our best interests at heart. Because if I vent to you about something that has made me mad, now you're mad at this person, and we go into gossiping. I can't believe she did that to you. Yeah, me too, and things like that. And we're not even venting with an agenda to try to get rid of anger. We're just talking about it and kind of stirring it up.
And that's where we have to be careful as Christian counselors and ministers and brethren to say, when somebody's frustrated, and I don't know what to do, and I've got to tell you what happened so you understand where I'm at and what I'm dealing with, and I'm asking, is this right, is that right? We're in good ground, okay. But as soon as it becomes an attack, now you're stepping into wrath, and you have to be able to pull them back. And if someone else is feeding that attitude of attack, they don't have your best interest in mind.
Through your echo chamber.
Exactly. So as we do now, this brings up the next point I was going to make. We've got to recognize our triggers, not simply now sometimes you do need to avoid those things. There are some times that I will not enter into a dialogue on something. Somebody wants to, and I'm like, I'm not going to enter into it right now because I'm going to end up losing my cool. I know I am. This is not going to end well. They're already pushing my buttons. I've got to let this set before I address it. But there's also times where we recognize our triggers because we say, okay, I need this trigger to be disassembled. And I need to go to God for that. And I need to go to others. When you progress from the venting approach, not anger expression, but anger management is what psychology will look at today. Anger management, that's great. But still, you're managing an eruption that still exists. So really what you're doing is you're controlling behavior rather than uprooting the cause. Scripture says uproot the cause through God and one another. That means it has to be addressed in right context within Christian community. Solitude only intensifies uncorrected faults. Remember what Dietrich Bonhoeffer says in Life Together. Sin thrives in darkness. It must be brought to the light. You gotta talk to people about it. You gotta pray with people about it. The person will quickly revert to their untrained nature when the opportunity comes if they're not being discipled. And this is not being identified and eradicated. We must cultivate patience. We must cultivate humility in the community of like-minded friends. The answer to wrath is not abstinence, because you're still going to get angry. It is patience and humility and gentleness. And that is cultivated within community. The irony is that anger and wrath preclude community. That's why the devil uses wrath to divide churches. Because if churches are divided and mad at each other, they can't develop humility and patience and gentleness. And they will be... Think about the book of Exodus. External persecution is consistently leveled against the Israelites. And they only unite stronger. But once internal strife enters the picture, they fall apart. Same thing happens in the book of Judges. Same thing happens in the book of Acts. External persecution only strengthens the body of believers, but internal strife will destroy it. How do you bring in internal strife? Wrath. Pride. Demanding your way. That's the trick of the enemy. That's why John Cassian said that a monk must be trained in the monastic community before he ventures into the desert alone. Quoting him, "Whatever faults we bring with us uncured into the desert, we shall find to remain concealed in us and not to be got rid of." So, what it does, when you talk about wrath, when you keep it internal, it's like your wrath goes from a wide pipe to a narrow pipe to a narrow pipe. It's funneled. It's fixated. What happens when water goes from larger to smaller pipes? Does anyone know? What?
Pressure increases.
Pressure increases. That's how fire hydrants work. But when you have community, you go from that narrow to wider to wider to wider. It dissipates. The pressure is eased. The opportunities widen. So, what are we going to do? I'm at time here. Some ways to get that under control, to identify your triggers, to manage your anger. Keep a journal for a few weeks. Write down every time you got angry, what you were angry about. Rate the intensity of each episode on a scale of 1 to 5. And then look for patterns that emerge. And then ask, why does that make me angry? Get some other perspective. If someone was watching the videotape of events that made you wrathful, not your edited version, but the actual event, would they come to the same conclusion as you? If not, you probably have some presuppositions. The question is why? Or fears, whatever the case. But realize that physical strategies such as that are just symptom control. They do not get at the source of the problem. To unlearn the habit of wrath requires a change of heart. To have a change of heart, pride is the root. You've got to face your assumptions about who you think you really are and what is really owed to you, and how much control over yourself and your world you desire and assume that you have. You got to consider what makes you feel threatened, what makes you feel secure, and why. Ultimately, you've got to learn to trust God's justice and God's control. Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. You know how to determine whether you are truly a Christ-like servant? Look at how you react when someone treats you like a servant. That will tell you a whole lot about your pride condition. Yeah. Look at how Jesus was treated. Look at how he responded. The reality is, reactive anger is usually a secondary emotion. So, start praying this. Lord, give me patience. I hear people all the time, don't pray for patience because then God's going to put you to the test. Well, the Bible says, let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete and lacking nothing. Why do we need patience? Because reactive anger is usually a secondary emotion. You have a primary emotion that evokes the anger that then proceeds into wrath. So you feel hurt and you become angry. You are afraid and you become angry. You are jealous or you are threatened and you become angry. So what Patience does is it cuts it off at the first one. It causes you to pause and not react in anger. And then to identify the primary feeling. Why was I hurt? Why was I afraid? And if the problem is with me, I address it with God and with others in community. If someone did something, then I don't explode on them in anger. I address what they did. Hey, this thing that you said really hurt me. Or, this is causing me anxiety. I'm addressing the catalyst rather than allowing the wrath to control. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. And that will reconstitute your brain, because patience stopping automatic reaction, it allows our brain to engage in a new way, and then you'll start doing that as a habit. And that's an important thing to do. It's not situations or people that make us angry, but what we think about those situations and people. That's why we got to get rid of our stinking thinking.
Yeah.
Restraining anger keeps your judgment and your reason clear. And it lets you consider, why am I feeling this way? Let me address that. Okay? We must cultivate humility. Let me read a passage for you real quick. I know I'm over time. Listen to what Paul says. Do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind, regard one another as more important than yourselves. Do not merely look out for your own personal interests, but also for the interest of others. Have this attitude in yourselves, which also was in Christ Jesus, who, although he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a bondservant, and being made in the likeness of men. Being found in the appearance of a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even the death of the cross. That nailed it.
Yeah.
We must cultivate patience. We must cultivate humility. We must cultivate gentleness. Gentleness channels the power of righteous anger rather than allowing it to sweep them away. It's not self-restraint. It's transformation into Christ-like character. So, some questions for self-reflection. And these will be good for when you journal your anger episodes. And then these are some good questions to ask yourself. Ask God, maybe ask others, and to pray on. Do I lose my temper easily? If so, why? Do I overreact to situations? Do I have health problems in which anger might be a factor? Do other people irritate me a lot? Do I tend to blame others for my problems? Do I think that other people make me mad? If you can answer yes to any one of those, your wrath is knocking on your door, if not already moving in. Some other questions. What makes me angry? What are my triggers? What have I learned about my anger and how to manage it? And is it just symptom control? What is my anger history? What style of anger did I learn as a child? When and where is it hard for me to be patient? What helps me be patient? If we can answer those questions, we're going to be able to see what the flesh, the world, and the devil already see within us. Triggers. How to push our buttons. If we can see our buttons, then we can join with others to say, let's pray that God would disassemble this button. Then all of a sudden those things aren't bothering us anymore. But make no mistake about it, the buttons are within us. And they are our own. Amen?
Amen.
Any questions or comments? Contemplations or conundrums? Complaints, criticisms? I'm out of alliteration. What else you got?
Very timely to talk about anger, or wrath rather, right
Wrath.
now.
That's more that.
Wrath is sweeping over
The
the
word.
earth.
And listen to many of the statements made by a wrathful society. Most of it is self-aggrandizing, self-oriented. What is,
Demands, we demand.
yes. It's time for people like Dr. King in this modern generation to stand up and say, this is not the answer. You cannot overcome hatred with hatred. You cannot overcome oppression with pride.
Yeah.
It's love. Good to go?
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'm glad that no one got angry that I went over time. All right. God bless you all. We'll look forward to continuing. I trust and pray we will hear testimonies as God is delivering us from all of these issues
Amen.
as we grow in His grace and holiness. Amen.
Amen.